Welcome to Danny Houlihan's Irish Experience podcast. Join Danny on a journey through the historical island of Ireland, its people and the wild Atlantic Way, which is Ireland's last frontier. Experience the music and the culture that makes up the longest coastal driving route in the world. Now, please welcome your host, Danny Houlihan.
Couldn't fault a good Leon Atlantic Ian. Welcome to the Wild Atlantic Way and Danny Houlihan's Irish Experience Show. Our studio Ballybunion Burning the Shannon Kunde Kiri from the banks of the Shannon River on the mighty Wild Atlantic Way, County Kerry, Ireland. And as usual, if you're jogging, walking or cycling, please take care. This interesting article appeared in the newspapers of the day, dated Friday evening, July 16th, 1915, and sheds a light once more on the activities of the wolfish landlords in the area and the background to a potential outbreak of local anger in the direction of the landlord and Spic, known as the Scottish Provident Company, that held leases in the area at that time. I have to set the background to this episode, which is steeped in history and the initial development of the seaside resort we know now today in Ireland as Ballybunion. The properties of the tenants were built on the former part of the Houlihan estate, or the Harrington estate as we know it as, and were rented to a middleman by the name of Raymond, who in turn rented the plots to the tenants in question. Quote, the tenants took the land from a middleman called Raymond. They built fine houses and hotels, which was a half a century ago a little-known fishing village at the mouth of the Shannon, was converted into a charming and popular seaside resort. Now, we know from the history and this quotation that Ballybunion originally was not a seaside resort, but a very small fishing village at the mouth of the Shannon River, and indeed was converted by the hard work of its residents into a charming and popular seaside resort. The quotation goes on. Then George Houlihan, not the old George Houlihan, but a newer George Houlihan, entered the scene and issued leases with the tenants for, quote, tenants held long leases for lives, and the last of these expired last February 12th, months ago, 1914. The last life was Lord Ventry, unquote. It goes on again in detail. They were the principal guarantors for the railway on the monorail system that connected their town with the Great Southern and Western Railway at Listowel. It was their enterprise that made the place known and accessible. Now this is where we find out who built what in Ballybunion at that time. Quote, to the building and other improvements, neither the middle landlord nor the head landlord contributed a farthing. Basically, it was our local people that built the original Ballybunion, not the landlords. Now everyone, this area would have been under the Houlihan estate or Harrington estate. The Houlihan estate or Harrington estate, as it was known as, was embroiled in a massive court litigation in the latter stages of the 18th century, with the local parish priest, Father Mortimer O'Connor, taking on the rights of the tenants and the occupiers of the day. This action ended in a long and lengthy court process, which was costly and forced the crusading priest to America for funds, and America did help the man. Now, everyone, I will just give you a taste of the background to this incident because it's large. This was going to boil on all fronts. Ballybunion Burning. The estate, as I stated, was a former Houlihan estate, which covered most, if not all, of the area of Ballybunion, Houlihan, where Ballybunion town is located today. The estate was sold in the encumbered estate court in the late 1870s. It was purchased by a syndicate, of which the late Sam Hussey, the notorious land agent in North Kerry, was chief. Just to point out, other partners in this were Goodman Gentleman and George Houlihan of Ennismore. Yes, the old George Houlihan of Ennismore. The syndicate outbid the tenants, whose offer was considered by the judge full value for the property. Mr. Hussey recouped himself and his partners in this transaction for their excessive price by increasing the rents on the local tenants. Unquote. This is the historical background to this particular period and time, and this event. Tenants basically wanted to buy their land after all their hard work over the years, which they put in, but the larger syndicate, led by Hussey and others, moved in to outbid and then increase the rents. The area of Ballybunion was very lucrative indeed. This is Ballybunion Burning. The time date now is 1914 to 1915. We have moved on. George Houlihan of Ennismore, landlord, who eventually bought the estate, had died in 1896, and his estate and records of his transactions and whatever leases were there were now under the control of what we've been told it was his nephew, George Houlihan of Dromahair, County Leitrim, and a company which had a short title called SPIC, the Scottish Provident Company. Now, I have seen documents that tally that this new Houlihan starts his trouble early on in his position in 1908. From an old tattered document that was given to me many, many years ago in Ballybunion by the late Johnny Higginbottom, I can see the history relating to our parish. And it was a letter from an ancestor of his by the name of Patrick O'Carroll. Quote, I have been speaking to several of the tenants, the majority of whom, myself and the number, declared their preference for purchase to a renewal of leases. Of course, you will bear in mind our conversation that none of us are prepared to pay extravagant prices, while every one of us is prepared to meet you more than halfway. Faithfully yours, Patrick O'Carroll, unquote. So this is direct evidence and provenance that under the Scottish Provident Company and George Houlihan, activity was getting very, very strong in their chances to get a grip on the seaside town of Ballybunion. So there's rumbles in the jungle, folks, and something big was boiling and about to burn. But to be fair, the evidence is quite clear that the Ballybunion tenants were prepared to meet the greedy landlords and his company halfway. There were a fair group of people, and indeed, myself and everyone are very, very proud of them. Quote, the middleman lease had expired. The tenants came under the Scottish Provident Institution of Edinburgh, to whom the mortgages had reverted. The tenants of Ballybunion were now going to be put under pressure to pay, and SPIC was going to make them do so. Ballybunion had become very, very popular, and the visitors flocked to the resort. The greedy eyes of the institution now wanted their hands on the place. After all, it was the local people who put the work in. This company and its director had put nothing into the seaside resort of Ballybunion, but their eyes were on it. As we see in the papers of the day, the Scottish Institution, or SPIC, as it was known locally as, immediately commenced a massive rent increase, not just for the ground rent, but for the buildings, demanding from the individuals £2 or £3 even more. Quote, the Scottish Provident Institute Company demands rent 12, 15 and 17 times the rents. Unquote. In other words, they were now going to pay the rent for where the land or business was, but now for the buildings, they built and paid for by their hard work and enterprise, which they put in over the decades, and their efforts to develop Ballybunion as a seaside resort. Now everyone, we must remember that some of these residents, both male and indeed female, it was like a 50-50 divide, were now getting older, and they hoped that they would pass their hard work onto their children. Now all this was in the balance. Before I move on, it has been related to me by a local person whose ancestors are in the United States now, that there was a threat of conscription during the First World War, and it was about to be put on the local people in the village, and that the young male members of these families were a target and were to be conscripted by the English army and dumped on the front line to be killed during the war. Indeed, many families had their sons sent to America to avoid this happening. As a historian, though, I have to investigate more on this and find a true paper trail, or indeed a smoking gun. This indeed was the cruel atmosphere that a small seaside village was dealing with, where its normal routine was tourism. Now, one thing I have noticed through the history books, events occur approaching or during the summer months, when everyone in Ballybunion is so busy. Well, Ballybunion is a traditional family seaside resort. People are busy. It's a factor, to this day and time, we must be very vigilant about, because our eye is off the ball, so to speak. This is a historical lesson for the town, and was really never spoken of. It was buried in the mists of time, which is a pity, to forget the past. Unfortunately, the past can come back to revisit a place. Watch, for ye know not the hour, Ballybunion. All plans were proceeding nicely for the greedy landlord and his company, until a few local incidents highlighted the seriousness of the position of the town, when 3 tons of hay went up on fire in March on land by a local businessman and tenant of the town, Mr. Enright. Headlines from the newspaper screamed, "A claim of appeal, threatening notices, town tenants and house owners. Ballybunion was burning." A burning of a reek of hay highlights the impending evictions and the atmosphere that existed in the village and its residents, both male and female, during the weeks and months leading up to the burning of the big massive reek of hay. The morning of the burning, a private member of the Leinster Regiment, who was based at the wireless station on Santal Road, not the Marconi radio station, folks, because Marconi was not even Ballybunion at that time. It was the Universal Radio Syndicate's powerful wireless transatlantic station that was there at that time. And we have from the documentation, the pictures of the period, a photograph which shows the Leinster Regiment being based there and their tents being pitched there. Now, he reported the incident to the local police of a fire just off the main street, Ballybunion. It would be behind where Courtney's Bar is today in Ballybunion, the field. It was a long field. The field was leased, quote, "The field was rented from the landlord by an Enright man in the town. There was bad feeling about him in the town, it was stated, because that he had recently entered negotiations concerning the rent price of his land with the landlord, but he went behind the backs of his fellow residents, or that the landlord approached him in a bid to upset the Tenants Association, who would treat the man as a black leg, thus initiate trouble would ensue amongst the locals." Unquote. Everyone, this cannot be ignored, and the ruthless tactics of these landlords and their companies divided and conquered. That was the order of the day, folks. That was the order of the day. Also from the quotation, we get another sense of the area, and just to get a picture of it, quote, "The field was sectioned off by a barbed wire fence near the Lartigue monorail system. This was used for grazing cattle and hay, which was then sold on for a decent price. A small road led off this section of land. That road today runs down to where the community centre is." Unquote. So everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this brief podcast. This is part 1 of part 2, because part 2 is fairly lengthy. So I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. This is the lead up to something very, very big. So until we meet again from the banks of the Shannon River, I say slán. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to our show. Through its people, its heritage, and its rugged coastline, this is truly Danny Houlihan's Irish experience. Bye for now.